I have to tell you that the resurrection of Jesus at Easter always brings a series of misconceptions to the fore. I cannot tell you the number of stories and beliefs that I've heard, but let me just share a couple with you. The first and funniest blooper is that when he rises from the dead, if Jesus sees his shadow, there will be 6 more weeks of winter. We are confusing Punxsutawney Phil and Jesus. And both were wrong this year, as you know from this glorious weather. The second misconception is still humorous, but carries a bit more weight. People tend to see the resurrection as a do-over, that God made a mistake and then resurrects Jesus to correct that error. But God makes no mistake, but allows humanity to kill God's beloved child to show the way to transformation in the resurrection. The third is another idea which is more subtle and pernicious, and that is that Jesus died a Jew, but somehow in his resurrection became a Christian. The belief that Jesus is saved, that is, made a Christian, by his own death is certainly not true. Jesus was born a Jew, lived a Jew, died a Jew, and is resurrected as a Jew. But we are saved as Christian people by Jesus' death and resurrection. And the last misconception is related to the first of Jesus as Punxsutawney Phil, seeing his shadow, because when Jesus does rise from the dead, Jesus does see his shadow on the ground. The resurrection is real, not simply a metaphor for the cyclical nature of life, of birth and death succeeding one another. This is not Elton John singing The Circle of Life from The Lion King. The resurrection is about more than that, and it is not simply a metaphor or a spiritual experience that the disciples alone had. The resurrection, in fact, gives us an in-the-body experience. It gives us the grave clothes cast aside, the spices scattered, perfuming the air, the stone too heavy for one person to move, that stone rolled away, and Jesus incarnate, Jesus in our flesh, walking on the earth once again. It gives us this to be true and real, even if not scientifically verifiable. And the resurrection affirms our humanity as much as Jesus' incarnation does. American writer John Updike, who died in 2009, was an Episcopalian, thanks be to God. And in a poem that he wrote called The 7 Stanzas on the Resurrection, he speaks of the physical nature of Jesus' body on this Easter day. He begins, "Make no mistake. If he rose at all, it was as his body. It was not as the flowers each soft spring recurrent. It was not as his spirit in the mouths and fuddled eyes of the 11 disciples. It was as his flesh, ours." Now, we Episcopalians are generally not biblical literalists. We do not read the Bible literally. But sometimes our sophistication and even our skepticism tends to get in the way of our beliefs. And when the skepticism and sophistication do, then we are as blind as Mary is in the garden this morning when she meets the risen Christ. And we, like Mary, do not willfully miss the resurrected one, but we assume, as she did, that things will always be the way that they have been. So let's use some of that biblical sophistication that we have to get to the matter at hand in the resurrection. I want to take you on a little tour of seminary and introduce you to Bible 101 that we all had to take. The first thing we learned in our first class in the Bible are 2 fundamental principles about biblical interpretation. The first is that the simplest version of events is most likely the earliest and hence most closely connected to what happened. Think about it in your own life. The closer you are to an event, the cleaner the telling is. And second, the things that are repeated in the greatest number of accounts are most likely closest to the truth. That is, grains of truth tend to travel through time and space. You know that as well. When you tell family stories, there are certain things that remain the same even as perhaps the details change. The truth remains. And so, the earliest gospel account and the latest versions of the resurrection vary in the details. Sometimes the details get a little confused. For example, who discovered the tomb first, or who was the first to see the resurrected one? But on the whole, the accounts of the resurrection agree on two very important things. First, that the tomb was empty, and second, that Jesus rose in his body from the dead. Every account, whether in the Gospels or the account that we heard in Paul's letter today, all the accounts tell of these two things. The tomb was empty, and Jesus appeared in bodily flesh. Resurrection is not only about that bodily flesh of Jesus, it is equally about our bodies 2,000 plus years later. The flesh which God has blessed, first at creation, then at Jesus' incarnation, and now at the resurrection. Flesh, which is good, we celebrate our flesh and live into it. We live through it, and we do not deny these bodies as Episcopalians. That is what Updike tells us. Soul and body, the resurrection tells us, are not separable elements. One in which we live, that is our bodies, and one in which we are raised at the resurrection, that is just our soul. Body and soul are intertwined, for we live our spiritual lives in, by, and through this fleshly body, the same body that Christ had. These bodies affirm the reality of the resurrection, as I said, and Updike recognizes the truth of this in his poem. He continues, "Let us not mock God with metaphor, analogy, sidestepping transcendence, making the events a parable, a sign painted in the faded credulity of earlier ages." He goes on to say, "Let us walk through the door. The stone is rolled back, not paper mache, not stone in a story, but the vast rock of materiality that in the slow grinding of time will eclipse for each of us the wide light of day." Christ in the resurrection affirms Updike's vast rock of materiality. He does not deny it by appearing as spirit or only as fire burning in the disciples' hearts, but Jesus appears as corporeal materiality, as flesh. Now, even though John Updike is an Episcopalian, at this point I part company with him, because he scoffs at reading the Easter events in any way other than literally. We know that resurrection is richly about metaphor, about analogy, about parable, and certainly about transcendence. If we believe that resurrection is only about the ends of our lives, then we, like Mary, are missing much of the gospel message. We are missing the good news. Let me share with you a story that was originally told by preacher Barbara Brown Taylor, which tells of resurrection in this life. Taylor's friend Matilda had ALS, more commonly known as Lou Gehrig's disease. And you know that causes muscular degeneration. First, Matilda lost control of her face, then her vocal cords, and then her legs. Confined at home in a wheelchair for the last year of her life, she only communicated by writing on a slate. You remember that kind that you used to have as a kid with the film? You'd write with the stylus and then pull back the film and write again. She had one of those. This was the day before iPads, okay? Or as Stephen Hawking devices, you know, the things that he has. So she had this slate, and she would write on it and communicate with people. And in the last year of her life, she found many things to write about and be excited about. And sometimes she would write and erase so fast that nobody could read it. Matilda found many things to be excited about. She taught herself to paint until the walls of her kitchen were covered with spring flowers. Barbara Brown Taylor says, every time Matilda thought she had lost something that she could not live without, she found that she could. Something new moved in to fill the empty place. A fresh series of paintings, a new friend, or a deeper sense of God. One day, Matilda wrote on her slate, "He is calling me. He is calling me like a bridegroom calling a bride." God is calling Matilda. And how can we not believe that Matilda experienced the joy and awe and mystery of the resurrection in her living and in her dying? How can we not believe that what she felt in that call to God of a bridegroom to a bride, of lover to lover, was the call of the resurrection life in Christ Jesus? Matilda teaches us that we do not have to wait for resurrection until we die at the end of our earthly lives. We can live resurrection life now. For Matilda, for each of us, and for all of us collectively, Jesus died and rose again so that we may experience resurrection life beginning now and continuing forever. Make no mistake, if he rose at all, it was as his body, it was as his flesh, it was as ours. And as Easter people, we acclaim that and say, Alleluia, Alleluia, Alleluia.